All right, Alexander, let's talk about what is happening with Starmer and Macron and their plans to send troops into Ukraine. Last reports are that Starmer is looking at 30,000 European troops in Ukraine should a ceasefire be agreed on. So the Europeans, led by the UK and by France, they're going to enter Ukraine as a peacekeeping force. Macron said that he doesn't care whether Russia agrees or not. He said Ukraine is a sovereign nation. If they invite us into Ukraine, there's a ceasefire and they invite us in to keep the peace, we're going in. Mm-hmm. Starmer gave a speech the other day and said that the UK is now moving into the operational phase of boots on the ground in Ukraine. And the Russians continue to send warnings to the Europeans and to the Americans. To the Americans, don't trust the Europeans. They're trying to sabotage our peace talks. And to the Europeans, don't step one foot in Ukraine. If you do, then you will be seen as enemy combatants and you will be quickly annihilated.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on,
on
Macron and Starmer?
You're absolutely right. The Russians on this are absolutely clear. And Lavrov, as you discussed, gave that warning to the Americans just a couple of days ago. We discussed it in a previous program in which he said, don't trust the Europeans. The Europeans are trying to use the Ukrainians to trick you. And you must be aware of that, because obviously if you're not, then this whole process could unravel. And Medvedev has issued a ferocious message about all of this idea of peacekeepers and how in order for peacekeepers to enter into Ukraine, absolutely there has to be an agreement with Russia. And the Russians have already said that in order for peacekeepers to be able to enter Ukraine legally as peacekeepers, they must do so with the authorization of the UN Security Council, in which Russia has veto power. And if that isn't done, then they won't regard those troops who enter Ukraine as peacekeepers. So the Russian position could not be more clear. And they are repeating it even as we're making this program. So Starmer just plows on. He goes on planning this. Macron plows on, and you can see what the plan is. Get a ceasefire, any ceasefire. Get Zelensky to agree to deploy the peacekeepers. The Europeans go in, and a British minister, West Streeting, said that if the Russians attack them, it'll be a massive escalation and the blame will be on Russia. So, you can see, you disregard Russian warnings. The Russians say that the peacekeepers should not enter. You nonetheless insist on sending them there. That is not an escalation. If the Russians carry out their threats and attack the peacekeepers, that is the escalation. Now, it's an incredible, wild game. And can I say, Starmer called this meeting, it was a virtual meeting, 27 nations supposedly attended. The media here in London has not published a list of the attendees. It's quite extraordinary, actually. I mean, so we don't quite know the whole details of who attended and what happened. The Daily Telegraph was then briefed afterwards by officials who are familiar with what apparently took place. Those officials said that, in fact, there was no consensus about deploying peacekeeping forces to Ukraine. So when Starmer is talking about moving to an operational phase, it's only a minority of hardline countries. Britain, France, maybe some others, but, far from the 30,000 men that Starmer is talking about. Starmer also had to accept that the Americans have not provided any guarantee or backstop, even though he continues to say that that is needed. But there's been no word about that from the Americans, that they've no signs so far that they are reversing their position. So what is this all about then? Well, I think that this is fulfilling multiple different roles. Firstly, it's intended to create trouble between the Americans and the Russians, to introduce into this an issue which could perhaps lead to the breakdown of the negotiations between the Americans and the Russians. The second is that it's also part of that long-term policy that we've discussed many times to try to drag the Americans into the conflict. Now, all of this is reckless. It's completely irresponsible. The most extraordinary thing about this is that Starmer is persisting with this, despite the fact that in Britain, there is a mounting backlash against this idea. There is an article today in the Daily Telegraph, of all places, by Nick Timothy, who was one of Theresa May's advisors, in which he eviscerates this proposal. He's saying, why is Starmer doing this? What is this about? We have seen evidence that Starmer's popularity, after a brief bump, is declining again. We've had more information that Britain is in recession. The economic numbers for January were terrible. There is a major rift within the Labour Party because Starmer wants to carry out cuts to various welfare benefits, and there's talk about a rebellion within the Labour Party. And there's increasing grumbling that Starmer is giving more time to Ukraine. Even before the Ukraine crisis, all this talk about peacekeepers and peacekeeping contingents started, there was already talk in Britain that he was spending around half his time on foreign policy. And now the view is that he's spending around 2/3 or 3/4 of his time on foreign policy, even as the situation within Britain deteriorates. And people are asking, what is he doing? And has he thought this through? And is this really a workable or viable plan? And that he's setting up Britain and whatever European allies he has with him for disaster. And there's growing doubts and many questions. But put all that aside, this is a very dangerous proposal. It is at some level absurd that the British and the French are coming up with these ideas, apparently without the Americans, without the guarantee from the Americans, without the troops really to send to Ukraine, with no operational plan for these troops. But it doesn't make it any more dangerous that they're coming up with these ideas in defiance of the very, very clear warnings that they're now getting from the Russians.
It's absurd from all of those aspects that you just mentioned. But I mean, the absurdity of it is, wouldn't the Russians know that these thousands of troops are heading into Ukraine? I mean, can they be hidden? How do they even have these troops? How do they get there? Once they get there, don't the Russians see them? The minute they cross over the border, don't the Russians just annihilate them? And then what?
And then what? Well,
Starmer goes to Trump and say, help us, please help us. And the United States has already said, no, we're not going to help you. We're not involved in any. The United States has told Europe, go into Ukraine. They've told them, if you want, go in. We don't have a problem with it, but we're not giving you any backstop or anything.
Yeah. Well, this is exactly the point that Nick Timothy made in that article in the Daily Telegraph. We send the troops in. They're going to be massively under-equipped. They're going to be relatively few. What are these troops supposed to achieve? And if the Russians do attack them, what then? What exactly happens? This is the question mark that Starmer isn't answering. In fact, the title of the article is "The Prime Minister Cannot Dodge the Hard Questions over Ukraine." And that is, of course, exactly what Starmer is doing. Now, I think that you have to understand what Starmer is all about, because Starmer is very unlike any other British Prime Minister that I can remember, because there's already been a book that's been published which says that fundamentally he's a cutout, that he's not really the person who is in overall charge, I am absolutely sure that this plan that we're seeing being put together has been discussed by Starmer, or at least by Starmer's people, the people who are running Starmer, not just with the French and with the other Europeans, but with their friends in the United States. Remember, Starmer has his contacts with the Democratic Party. We know all about that. He's got his contacts they have their contacts in the American deep state as well. So this is not quite as absurd as it appears to be on the surface. It's more dangerous than it appears to be on the surface, because Starmer is pursuing, or rather the people behind Starmer are pursuing, two objectives here. One is to bring Britain back into Europe, bring Britain back into the EU, because this is going to be a force which the British is going to be participating in, which is going to be made up predominantly of European countries. So even if this never gets off the ground, Britain again is involved in Europe. It's discussing things with the European leadership. It's talking to Macron. It's talking to Ursula. It's behaving almost as if, in terms of security policy, it already was a European country. So bear in mind, that agenda is always there. Bring Britain back deeper into Europe again. But secondly, it's intended to create ultimately a crisis in Ukraine, a crisis with the Russians, and a crisis which they hope not only will involve the United States, but which ultimately will damage Donald Trump himself. Because if there is a crisis with the Russians, then if Donald Trump doesn't rush to the Europeans' rescue, he'll be accused of betrayal and all of that. And of course, if he does, well, he's committed to Ukraine. And then people will be able to turn around and say to him, look, we warned you, you can't trust the Russians. And here you did, here you have, and you look where it's got us. So it is ultimately intended to bring Britain closer into Europe, preparatory to Britain ultimately rejoining the EU again. That is obviously a part of the agenda. And the second, as I said, is to undermine Donald Trump.
Yeah, how can you allow the Russians to annihilate our number one ally, our special relationship with the UK? How can you allow this to happen, President Trump? Exactly. You really are a Putin puppet. You really were. You really were trained by the KGB or whatever they're going to. This is like Russiagate on steroids.
Yeah,
that's what they're hoping to turn this into.
Exactly. Yeah. And bear in mind, they will also say if there's a crisis with the British and the French troops in Ukraine,
which there will be,
if there is a crisis, they'll say if you don't rush to their rescue, you are destroying NATO.
Yeah,
because all of that. So, I think the Russians are trying to warn Trump about this. I don't get the sense that he's fully understands.
No, he likes Macron.
He likes Macron.
He likes Macron. He has a weakness to Macron. I've never understood it.
No,
I don't
understand
this weakness that he has with Macron, but he has this affection to Macron. I don't get it.
No.
Starmer he doesn't like. But what does Trump do? How does the Trump team get ahead of this? Let's call it a trap, because that's what it is. How do they get ahead of this trap?
Well, there's two ways. Firstly, and I think they need to be much clearer than they've been up to now, that if the Europeans go into Ukraine, they are doing so not only without the support of the United States, but that the United States strongly disapproves of their going there. That will strengthen the very real opposition which exists in Britain and which is building. So, and not just Britain, I'm sure even more so in France. Bear in mind, more and more European countries are skeptical about this. Meloni, who is close to Trump, is known to oppose it. So I think the Americans need to be much clearer about their own opposition to this. And secondly, in order to prevent British and French deployments, if there is going to be any kind of ceasefire or perhaps cessation of hostilities, they need to work out the enforcement arrangements with the Russians. In other words, they need to address properly all the points that Putin made in his press conference of a couple of days ago. So, because if there are already ceasefire monitors, say from China and Brazil, or from India and Brazil, or from whomever, then, they could say, look, there is no role for the Europeans and they should stay out. So that's what they need to do. But above all, the Americans need to be alive to what this is all about. Now, I'm going to express here my own opinion about Starmer, which is that, in my opinion, Starmer is not there to succeed as prime minister, not in the conventional sense. If he leads the Labour Party to a massive electoral defeat in a couple of years, that's not the concern of the people who basically back him. They want him to keep Britain on a particular political course, back towards Europe, as I said, reversing Brexit to the extent that they can. Also, rolling back these changes in the United States. They used Starmer to crush Corbyn, and they're now using Starmer to do all of these other things. The fact that he isn't very interested in the state of Britain's economy, that he is trying to commit Britain to a rearmament program, which of course he can't fulfill, that ought to set alarm bells about what his genuine agenda is, or rather the agenda of the people who run him is. And the fact that, as I said, he's had all of these contacts, these historic contacts with the Democrats, and all of that should tell you who is really running the show in London.
Yeah, that's a really good assessment. Starmer is there to crush America first, to crush Trump, and he's there to crush Brexit.
Yeah.
And Russia, Ukraine, it helps him get closer to that agenda.
Exactly.
That's why he's doing this.
Exactly.
Should his bluff be called?
Yes.
I mean, because there is a lot of theatrics.
Yes.
In all of this. Obviously, there's a lot of theatrics. Everyone knows that the UK military is not going to last a week in Ukraine. Everyone knows the French military is not going to last 2 weeks in Ukraine. Everyone knows this.
Yes.
That's why there's a sense of fear and dread, but there's also a sense of just ridiculous. It's so ridiculous.
Yes. Yes.
That we're moving to this point. But should his bluff be called, for example, by the Russians? I don't know how you would do it. I don't know what statements you have to make. But what should Russia do in all of this outside of the warnings? I mean, Medvedev is saying, come on in and you're going to get annihilated, you scumbags. That's what he's using, words like that. That's the words that Medvedev used in his post. What should the Russians do? What
the Russians, I suspect, are actually doing is that they're trying to explain to Trump how dangerous this plan by the British and the French is. And they're probably going to try to explain to Trump, look, if you want to move forward with this, you've got to scotch this. You've got to make it absolutely clear to the British and the French, not just that you're not going to support what they're doing, but that what they're proposing is completely unhelpful and wrong, and that it is actually jeopardizing peace. For some reason, Trump seems very unwilling to do that. And that's the problem. He's avoiding giving security guarantees to the British and the French, but he's got to go I think he's got to go further. And I think this is what the Russians are going to say to him. You've got to go further, and you've got to tell the British and the French that if there's any such plan, the United States will oppose it. And they need to tell all the other European countries, if you go ahead with this, you are going against the wishes of the United States. And that will kill it, by the way. I think despite all the bluster in Europe, small countries like, say, the Czech Republic are not going to defy the United States on this one.
Poland's not going to. They've already said they're not going to defy the United States, but Poland will go in to Ukraine if the U.S. orders them to go in, and they'll stay out of Ukraine if the U.S. orders them to stay out of Ukraine. They're pretty much on record saying that. So let's play devil's advocate. What if Trump ends up supporting the U.K. and France? Say for some reason he gets this pressure from the neocon faction of of the Republicans or from the neocon faction of America First or whatever, all these forces in the U.S., the intel agencies, I don't know, let's say he gets his pressure. Trump himself, maybe Trump says, you know what, I really like that Starmer guy. I definitely like Macron. So I'm going to come to the rescue of our number one allies in France and the UK.
Then he risks drifting, and I'm being moderate in my language here. He risks drifting into a state where instead of getting peace, he finds himself in a crisis with Russia worse than the one that Kennedy faced in 1962. Just as that. I mean, that is how dangerous this is.
All right. We will end it there. TheDuran.locals.com. We are on Rumble, Odyssey, Picture, Telegram, Rockfin, and X. Go to the Duran shop, pick up some merch like what we are wearing in this video update. You will find a link to the Duran shop in the description box down below. Take care.